All right, let's dive into Cubism.
Yeah.
You guys sent in some seriously interesting articles, and we're excited to unpack all of this with you.
Yeah.
One that really stood out is this 5 Things to Know About Cubism from Rise Art.
Oh, yeah, it's a good one.
It's a good one. It's like a really great jumping off point for understanding this movement that even people who aren't like super into art have at least heard of, right?
Right.
But how much do we really know about Cubism beyond, you know, just the name and kind of the basic idea?
Yeah, it's pretty recognizable. But,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to like uncover some surprising facts.
Yeah.
Like, how did African masks end up influencing this very European art movement?
Right. It doesn't seem like an obvious connection.
No.
Yeah.
And get this, Cubism was basically created by only 2 people. What?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
2 people. Plus, Cubist poems. Like,
Royal, right?
we'll get to those too. So, buckle up.
It's going to be a wild ride.
It's going to be a wild, cubistly interesting ride.
I love that.
So, what I find so interesting is that Cubism, even though it, like, totally revolutionized art, it actually began by looking back, not just forward.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it wasn't this like complete break from the past,
Right.
but more like artists taking these old ideas and like, you know, remixing them in a totally new way.
Oh, I love that, a remix. So where does this remixing journey begin?
Well, the Rise Art article points to Paul Cézanne as a huge influence.
Wow.
He was this post-impressionist painter who was all about simplifying forms down to their basic like geometric shapes.
Okay.
And he even said that we should think about nature in terms of, you know, the cylinder, the sphere, the cone.
Oh, wow. And that idea totally resonated with Picasso and Braque, the 2 giants of Cubism.
That's exactly where they took it and ran with it.
And their article even mentions that a Cézanne retrospective in 1907 was a pivotal moment for them.
It was like this lightning bolt for them. You know, seeing all of Cézanne's work together in one place, it helped them see that they could break free from traditional realistic representation and experiment with like way more abstract ways of showing objects in space.
Okay, so Cézanne provided that foundation, but here's where things get even more interesting. This influence of African art on Cubism.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly what you would expect at first, right?
Yeah, it's one of those things that when you hear it, you're like, wait, really? But it makes total sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of the 20th century, European artists were becoming like really fascinated by what they called primitive art, especially African masks.
Okay.
And these masks with their like bold geometric shapes were just like nothing they'd ever seen before.
Right. And there's this like awesome story in the article about Matisse introducing Picasso to these masks, which was like a total game changer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was a huge moment. I mean, Picasso was totally blown away by how the masks like abstracted the human face. And, you know, it's not a coincidence that you start seeing similar elements kind of popping up in his work leading up to Cubism.
Yeah. So it's incredible how art from a completely different culture could ignite like a revolution in European art.
It really is.
But wait, there's another twist to the story. So Cubism wasn't this massive movement with tons of artists, was it?
Here's something that surprises a lot of people. Cubism was basically like the brainchild of just 2 artists, Picasso and Braque.
Really?
Yeah, just these 2 guys who were close friends, collaborators, constantly bouncing ideas off of each other and, you know, just pushing the boundaries of what art could be.
It's mind-blowing that like such a monumental shift in art history came from just 2 artists working together. It's amazing. But how did they even come up with the name Cubism?
Well, that part is a little bit of a mystery, but some art historians believe that an art critic actually coined the term after seeing some of Braque's paintings and like commenting on the cubes in his work.
Interesting. So 2 guys, a bunch of cubes, and bam, a whole new art movement is born.
It's kind of amazing how these things happen, right?
It is. Now, Cubism wasn't just one single style, right? It actually went through several phases, I know.
Yeah, you're right. The Rise Art article breaks it down into these 3 main phases.
Okay.
Cézannian, analytical, and synthetic.
Okay.
And each phase kind of reflects how Picasso and Braque's ideas about form, perspective, and representation evolved over time.
Okay, let's break down these phases a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
First up is Cézannian Cubism, named after Cézanne, obviously. This phase was all about deconstructing objects into those basic geometric shapes, while still kind of trying to maintain a sense of depth and perspective. It's almost like a bridge between traditional art and the more abstract stuff to come.
Right. Yeah, it's like they're taking Cézanne's ideas about form and space and like really pushing them to their limits. Like how abstract can we get
Right.
and still have people recognize what they're looking at?
Exactly. Okay. Then we get to analytical cubism, where things get a bit more complex.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. The article mentions Braque's violin and chandelier as like a prime example. Can you like walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so in that painting and other analytical cubist works, the objects are like fragmented and they're broken down into these multiple facets. It's kind of like if you were looking at a violin, but from like several angles all at once.
Oh, so instead of seeing a complete violin, you're seeing like parts of it from different perspectives kind of all smashed together on the canvas.
Exactly.
It's like a puzzle.
Yeah, kind of. And it's not just about like what something looks like from one angle,
Right.
It's about capturing its like essence, its multiple dimensions, even its conceptual essence,
Right.
It's a very intellectual way of thinking about art.
Okay, and that leads us to the final phase, synthetic cubism. So how does this one differ from that like super analytical stuff?
Well, this is where things start to loosen up a bit and get a little bit more playful. So Picasso and Braque, they simplified those complex, fractured forms of analytical cubism, and they started to incorporate like brighter colors, patterns, and even collage elements. So think textures, overlapping shapes, a really dynamic interplay of like forms and colors.
Okay, so it's like after all of that, like deeply analyzing and like deconstructing objects, they figured out how to put them back together in this totally new and engaging way.
Yeah, and it's not so much about dissecting objects as it is about like rebuilding them in this like bold new way.
Yeah, it's amazing how this one movement went through like such distinct phases.
It is. It really evolved a lot over time.
But hold on, we're not just talking about paintings here, are we?
Yeah.
I mean, this cubism thing went beyond the canvas, right?
You're right. Cubism was a total game changer. It wasn't just about painting, It had this huge impact on sculpture and even, believe it or not, literature.
Wow. So the Art article mentioned that it influenced sculptors like Lipchitz, Archipemco, and Duchamp-Villon.
Right.
Did they also use like fragmentation and geometric forms in their sculptures?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they took those cubist principles and brought them into the three-dimensional world.
Oh, wow.
Just like the paintings challenged how we see things on a flat surface. These sculptures made you experience those multiple perspectives as you like moved around them.
Oh, I can picture those sculptures now.
Yeah.
Like all angles and planes. But wait, the article mentioned something that like blew my mind, Cubist literature.
Yeah, it's not something you hear every day.
No. What's that all about?
So this guy, Guillaume Apollinaire, a French poet and a friend of Picasso's, he experimented with this form of poetry called calligrams.
Calligrams, all right, I'm all ears.
Okay, so picture this, like a poem where the words themselves are arranged to create a visual image on the page. So, like maybe a bird taking flight or like a shattered vase. That's the power of a calligram.
So you're not just reading the poem, you're experiencing it visually too.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
And Apollinaire was like really trying to capture the essence of Cubism, not just through the words, but through how they looked on the page. He was like breaking down language and rebuilding it in this visually dynamic way, just like Cubist painters did with objects in space.
Wow. That's a fantastic example of how Cubism wasn't just some passing trend in the art world.
Mm-hmm.
It was like this total new way of thinking about the world and how we see it and how we represent it.
It really was. And that's why it continues to fascinate us today.
And that brings us to this like crucial question. Why is Cubism still relevant today?
Yeah, it's a great question.
What can we learn from these artists who were breaking all the rules over a century ago?
It's a big one. And, it's something we're going to explore further. Right after this.
Okay, we're back and still kind of geeking out about Cubism,
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
It's fascinating. And it's wild to think that all of these Cubist ideas, the fragmentation, the multiple perspectives,
right.
It wasn't just about paintings. Like, it spread to sculpture and even poetry.
Oh, no, it's pretty wild.
It really makes you wonder, like, what was so groundbreaking about these ideas? That they spread to all these different creative fields.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? It's like these like really simple concepts, like breaking things down and showing multiple perspectives.
Right.
It just had this incredible power to change how people thought about all kinds of like creative endeavors. It was like a seed that was planted and then it blossomed in these unexpected ways.
I love that. You know, when I look at some of those early Cubist paintings, especially the analytical Cubism stuff, I got to admit, I get a little lost. Like, it's so fragmented. It's like hard to tell what you're even looking at sometimes.
I totally get it. Analytical Cubism can be pretty challenging, you know, but I think the key is to remember that they weren't really trying to create like a photorealistic image.
Right.
They were trying to dig deeper, to explore like the essence of their subjects.
So they were going beyond those surface appearances and trying to show like the underlying structure,
exactly,
the multiple facets of an object.
Yeah.
Even it's a conceptual meaning.
Yeah, it's like they're saying like, hey, let's break this thing down and see what it's really made of.
Exactly, yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And by doing that, they weren't just like challenging those traditional notions of representation. They were also like challenging the viewer to participate in that process of like making meaning of the artwork.
Right, exactly. It becomes this interactive experience where you, the viewer, have to kind of piece together those fragments and create your own understanding of the work.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like not passive viewing, but, you know, it's like an active process of discovery and interpretation.
Exactly. It's like they're inviting you into their creative process.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a dialogue between the artist and the viewer, a collaboration almost. And that's a big part of what makes Cubism so revolutionary.
Right. Okay, so I'm like starting to get it a little bit. But I still wonder, why make art so hard to understand?
Yeah.
Like, were they just trying to be difficult or elitist or something?
I mean, that's a question art historians have been debating for ages, you know?
Right.
But I think it's really important to consider the historical context here.
Okay.
So the early 20th century was a time of like massive upheaval and change.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
I mean, think about it. World War I was on the horizon, old social structures were crumbling, scientific discoveries like Einstein's theory of relativity were like shaking people's understanding of the universe.
Totally. So Cubism wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Exactly.
It was like a reflection of all of this change and uncertainty in the world.
It was. And, you know, Einstein was blowing people's minds by saying that reality wasn't as fixed and absolute as we thought.
Right.
And, you know, in a way, Cubism was doing something similar in the art world.
Okay.
You know, it was questioning those traditional ways of seeing and proposing this new way of understanding reality.
Yeah.
One that embraced multiple perspectives and fragmentation.
So it's like they're saying like, if reality itself isn't fixed, why should art be?
That's a great way to put it. And that's why Cubism still resonates with us today. You know, I mean, we live in a world where information is fragmented, perspectives are constantly shifting, and technology is like blurring the lines between what's real and what's virtual. In a way, you know, Cubism was ahead of its time.
That's a mind-blowing insight.
I know.
But, you know, if Cubism was like reflecting all of this change and uncertainty, why did it eventually move away from that like really fragmented style of analytical Cubism?
Right.
Why the shift to synthetic Cubism?
Yeah, so remember those 3 phases of Cubism we talked about?
Yes.
Well, as the movement evolved, those ideas about breaking things down and showing multiple perspectives, they started to take on new forms.
Okay.
And the artists started incorporating more color, texture, even like real-world objects into their artwork.
Okay.
And that's what we call synthetic Cubism.
Right. And the article even mentions that synthetic Cubism was like more playful. But like, what does that mean? How did it actually differ from that like analytical approach?
Well, think about it this way. So analytical Cubism was very like cerebral. It was all about analysis, taking things apart, examining them from every angle.
Right.
Synthetic Cubism was more about like synthesis, putting things back together in new and interesting ways.
Okay.
It was less about dissecting and more about reconstructing.
So it's like they took everything that they had learned from dissecting and analyzing objects in analytical Cubism, and then said, okay, now let's have some fun and rebuild these things in a whole new way.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about having fun, although that was certainly part of it, but they started experimenting with like different materials like newspaper clippings, wallpaper, even pieces of fabric.
Wow.
They brought in brighter colors, more dynamic compositions, just a sense of playfulness that was missing from those earlier, more austere works.
So it's like shifting from deconstruction to reconstruction, from breaking things down to building something new.
And you know, I think that shift reflects like a bigger cultural shift that was happening in the world at that time.
Okay.
So after the trauma of World War I, there was this sense of optimism, this desire to like rebuild and create something new and hopeful out of the wreckage of the past. And I think synthetic cubism embodies that spirit.
So synthetic cubism wasn't just a change in like artistic style. It was reflecting that changing world.
It was.
Yeah. And it's amazing how art can like capture those larger cultural currents and like reflect the hopes and anxieties of a particular time, you know?
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why Cubism continues to fascinate us, you know? It's not just about pretty pictures. It's about ideas.
Yes.
About history, about the human experience.
Yes. And this whole like deep dive has really, it's changed how I think about Cubism, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like not just about fragmented forms and confusing perspectives. It's about like challenging assumptions, exploring those new ways of seeing and like reflecting the complexities of the world around us. It makes me wonder like what happened to those Cubist ideas after that initial like burst of creativity?
Right.
Did they just like fade away or did they continue to influence other artists?
That's a great question, and it's one we're going to dive into right after this.
All right, we're back. And you know, it's wild to think about everything we've uncovered about Cubism so far.
I know, right?
From its roots in Cézanne's work and the influence of African masks to like the crazy experiments of Picasso and Braque, it's clear that this movement was like way more than just a passing trend.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was a total game changer in the art world.
Yeah. And we talked about how those Cubist ideas, like the fragmentation, the showing multiple perspectives, it wasn't just confined to those canvases, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It spread to sculpture, poetry, even.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those ideas jump from one art form to another.
It really makes you wonder, did Cubism's influence stop there?
That's a great question. And, well, the short answer is no, not at all. It didn't stop there.
So what happened after that initial explosion of creativity? Did other artists pick up on those Cubist ideas and kind of run with them?
Oh, they absolutely did. Cubism wasn't just a moment in time. It was like a catalyst for a whole wave of new artistic movements.
Okay. So what were some of the movements that were directly influenced by Cubism? Like what sprouted from those Cubist seeds, so to speak?
Well, one of the most immediate offshoots was Futurism, which popped up in Italy in the early 1900s. And like Cubism, Futurism was all about, you know, challenging those traditional perspectives and embracing the new. But they took those ideas in a very like dynamic and energetic direction. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
These artists were obsessed with speed, technology, the energy of modern life.
So while Cubism was kind of dissecting objects in space, Futurism was more about capturing like the movement and energy of the modern world.
Exactly.
Like the rush of a speeding car or like a power of a machine.
Yeah, they used those fragmented forms and multiple perspectives that we see in Cubism, but they applied it to things like cars, trains, airplanes, even the violence of war. I mean, they even wrote these wild manifestos praising the beauty of machines.
Wow, that's like such a radical shift from that more contemplative intellectual feel of Cubism. It almost sounds aggressive, you know?
It definitely had like a more aggressive in-your-face energy, you know?
Yeah.
But you can still see that Cubist DNA in the way they fractured forms and played with like space and time.
Okay, yeah. So another movement that took inspiration from Cubism but went in a very different direction was Dadaism.
Oh yeah, Dadaism. Now that's a movement that always makes me think of melting clocks and nonsensical poetry. Yeah, it's a pretty good summary. It emerged during World War I, and it was a reaction to the horrors and absurdity of that war, really.
Okay.
It was all about rejecting logic and reason, you know, all those traditional artistic values.
Yeah.
And they embraced chaos, nonsense, and used art to shock and provoke.
So if Cubism was revolutionary in its own way, Dadaism was almost like anti-art. It sounds like they were trying to tear down the whole system.
In some ways, yeah, you could say that. They weren't interested in creating beautiful or meaningful objects, you know, in the traditional sense. They wanted to disrupt, to challenge, to provoke.
Yeah.
But even in their rejection of those traditional art values, you can still see the influence of Cubism, especially in their use of collage, assemblage, and like everyday materials.
Yeah, so it's fascinating how Cubism like inspired such a wide range of movements. You know, some really different, even opposing in a lot of ways, really shows how powerful and flexible those core ideas were, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like they cracked open this portal to a whole new way of thinking about art, and all these other artists rushed through it, each taking those ideas in their own unique direction.
Yeah.
And Cubism's impact didn't stop there. It went on to influence later movements like surrealism, abstract expressionism, even pop art.
Wow. So even though Cubism itself, as a movement, lasted for a relatively short period, its core ideas kept rippling outward,
Totally, yeah.
influencing artists for decades to come.
And it wasn't about a specific style or technique, It was a fundamental shift in how artists thought about their work, how they saw the world, and how they chose to represent it.
That's incredible. It really is mind-blowing to think that those two guys, Picasso and Braque, just experimenting in their studios, they ended up having this monumental impact.
I know, it's pretty amazing.
They didn't just change art, they changed how we see the world.
They did. And their legacy lives on. I mean, even today, over a century after Cubism emerged, you can still see its influence in contemporary art and design. Those ideas about abstraction, multiple perspectives, challenging conventional ways of seeing, they're more relevant than ever in our digital age.
Yeah, I can see that. We're constantly bombarded with information, images from every direction, and the truth often feels fragmented and elusive, In a way, Cubism kind of prepared us for this world.
It's true. It taught us to question what we see, to embrace complexity, and to find beauty in the unexpected.
This deep dive has honestly been eye-opening. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of Cubism, not just as an art movement, but as a way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, and that's really the heart of it, isn't it? Cubism wasn't just about painting cubes or fragmenting forms. It was about expanding our perception, challenging our assumptions, and reminding us that there's always more to see, more to understand, if we're willing to look beyond the surface.
Well said. And what a fantastic journey this has been. You've given us all so much to think about, and we hope our listeners feel the same way. Thanks for joining us on this Cubist adventure. And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the world around you. We'll see you next time.